You fool Dropout from high school, even without any common sense. During the meeting, David, the sales manager, screamed, "What are you listening to? Remove it right away." David seems to be picking at my hearing aid. He should be aware that what I have on my ear is a hearing aid, not an earphone, as I had previously told him that I have hearing loss. David yells as if my hearing aid were a phone, even though he knows. My hearing impairment is unknown to those in other departments. David probably wanted me to appear as though I was just bored and didn't want to listen to him anymore. David got up, furious at my attitude, and abruptly toppled my chair. The conference room buzzed, and I fell to the ground. The meeting room door opened at that same moment. I apologize for being late. Jones, the CEO, burst into the meeting room in the middle of the chaos. Jones's eyes widened as he attempted to process what was happening as he became aware of the tight mood in the room. His normally bright cheeks turned pale, and a frown came on his face as soon as he saw me laying on the floor. David persisted, knowing that Jones was observing, asking, "Who do you think you are? Ignoring me? You dare not treat me rudely." Jones's face became much more pallid. I gave Jones a mischievous look and whispered to myself, "All right, that's enough." This spring, I became 40 years old. My name is James Smith. As a businessman, I now lived a typical life, but my life hasn't exactly been like other people's. One thing about me is that I am almost deaf. That is, I have hearing impairments. My bilateral sensorineural hearing loss started early in life. I feel like I'm down at the bottom of the sea all the time because of this unusual sickness. When I was a high school student, I became aware that something was wrong with my hearing. The sounds around me began to warp, and the symptoms continued to get worse instead of getting better. I went to the hospital, concerned about the increasing discomfort I was experiencing every day, and I was given this diagnosis. Early onset bilateral sensorineural hearing loss is a disorder that typically affects young patients and results in bilateral hearing loss. It entails harm to the inner ear nerves, which over time becomes more difficult to hear. I would eventually become fully deaf. I grew up afraid of this stillness that was coming. There were moments when I was afraid to live, and what had once been normal no longer was. It was difficult to strike a balance between the anxiety of entering a silent world and knowing how to exist in it. But that didn't mean I had to give up on life because I was losing my hearing. I didn't have to give up on my goals after losing my hearing. I got to this age because I made the decision to live life to the fullest and utilize what little I still had. Science has advanced to the point where high-performance hearing aids have been developed in tandem with the disease's progression. My ability to lip-read and communicate using sign language has become essential to daily life. Lip reading is the process of deciphering words by observing the speaker's lip movement and accounting for their expressions as well as the conversation's flow. Lip reading by itself, meanwhile, is insufficient to fully comprehend what other people are saying. I can't always hear well, even with a hearing aid. Consequently, I eventually piece together the speaker's lip movement and the bits of words I hear. My communication abilities are much improved by doing this. While I can't hear as well as someone with normal hearing, I can still hear better than them in certain situations. Something can be lost in order to get something new. I discovered this after being afflicted with this illness. I'm not having as much trouble leading an autonomous social life these days. I began working as a sales office clerk at a manufacturing company this spring. I recently started working for S Corporation, a company that produces electronic components. It belongs to S Holdings Group as a subsidiary. Although I work in the sales office, I was assigned to the sales department. As a result, I don't get many opportunities to interact directly with clients. Instead, the majority of my responsibilities include support activities like document preparation. I can therefore complete my allocated activities effectively, and my hearing disability rarely interferes with my employment. But there was a serious issue with the department to which I was assigned. David was the sales manager, and he was the issue. He is a traditional authoritarian boss that uses a haughty demeanor to try and dominate his employees. While this kind of fashion may have been appropriate in the 1970s, it is inappropriate in the modern era. Furthermore, David despises people with less education and physical impairments. He feels that those who are disabled or have poor levels of education are not deserving of consideration. My ultimate educational achievement is that of a high school dropout because of the illness that forced me to leave school. I am David's easy target. Our HR department hires brainless high school dropouts, not good individuals at all. Not only that, but he is deaf. Such a useless individual shouldn't be around. What a hardship. Can you hear me, please? It was during the introductions portion of our first meeting that David told me this. He probably assumed I couldn't understand him because he knew I had trouble hearing, so he felt free to say whatever he wanted. David is the type of person who would say things like that without hesitation, even if I could hear. I completely knew what David was saying, but I ignored his harsh comments and didn't allow them get to me. Rather than becoming upset over every hurtful remark, I pretended not to hear them and chose to ignore them. I came up with this coping mechanism over time. This strategy was also practical for completing my actual objective. Could you perhaps talk a little more slowly? I apologized. It's difficult to hear everything when you speak so quickly. David shot back. So you can't hear after all? I understand. I'm through. Even though David was making fun of me, I made sure to do my job perfectly. I was unable to allow David to take advantage of my vulnerabilities. I forced myself to learn this lesson when I started working in the sales department. David would use my deafness or lack of education as a justification to fire me if I made a mistake. That's what I had to accomplish flawlessly in order to avoid. I watched David's movements at the same time. I kept an eye out for David's questionable behavior to determine if he was unfairly pressing his colleagues or indulging in any unethical sales techniques. Building up evidence against David is a good strategy for self-defense. I may use his shortcomings as a weapon to defend myself and as a shield to retaliate when needed if I accumulate enough of them. To put it mildly, David treated his subordinates in a horrifying manner. He would make a lot of noise, insult them in front of everyone, and occasionally bring them into the conference room. It was not difficult to surmise what was going on inside. Perhaps he was beating them. But nobody was brave enough to disagree with David's ridiculous actions. His subordinates were entirely subjugated because of the length of time his dictatorial government had been in place. I too thought there was something off about the sales numbers David gave. Deliveries to one specific client were exceedingly high in volume. It didn't appear conceivable for the client to handle such a big number given their size. Furthermore, this customer was given a far bigger discount than other customers. Although offering discounts to big customers is common, the reduction percentage in this instance seemed odd. To put it mildly, it looked odd that an unusable quantity of electronic components could be supplied at such a low price. I thought David was trying to sell them off illegally. Was David providing client A with a substantial quantity of underperforming electrical components at a reduced price with the intention of reselling them to a different business, potentially an international broker? Client A would profit if they could sell the parts to a broker for a higher price. Since they would make money simply by passing on the items, it's not a bad deal. But a man like David wouldn't risk such things merely to be loyal to the business. He was most likely getting paid a kickback for introducing the broker because it would be illegal to resell the products internationally. That was my theory. If it were real, it would be a major betrayal of confidence, which is illegal. I chose to question David's subordinates to confirm my assumption, but they were all silent and tight-lipped. David had an unbreakable hold on his subordinates. While all of this was going on, David noticed what I was doing. Hey, dropout from high school. Why are you scubbling around behind the scenes, spying around, and acting like a rat? David's harsh statements put pressure on me. I'm not making any progress. I was purposefully stopping my speech to give the impression that I was helpless. I was just asking the sales staff about the delivery status. Stop lying. Are you not suspecting me of reselling? David, whether on purpose or not, dropped his voice. I was unable to clearly hear him speak as a result. Sorry, could you just speak up a little bit? Excusing myself, I said, I couldn't hear you. David grinned and spoke even less loudly. So, in all circumstances, you are deaf? You look about for my underlings, but they refuse to speak to you. I'm trying to hide the bad sales results for them. Being hard of hearing must be difficult. You overlook my crucial remarks, David said with a sneer. I could tell he was making fun of me by the look on his face, but I was unable to decipher his words. I apologize for not hearing from you. Would you kindly say it again? I gave a loud shout. David gave me a menacing smirk and pressed his lips to my ear. No, hold on. My hearing aid picked up his loud voice, causing my ear to ring. I scowled at David while covering my ear. How does that look? David struck my head and left the room, saying, You have something you want to say to me. My head experienced a surge of blood. Someone like that couldn't go unchecked, in my opinion. I felt the wave of righteousness pass through me. I wanted to run after him and give him the finger. I could use force to subdue David if I so desired, but that wouldn't address the underlying issue. I refrained from speaking, and instead of venting my frustration, I wrote down the details I had heard. David started to put more and more pressure on me after that day. David had simply mentioned my hearing problem and lack of education up until that point, but lately he had gotten more aggressive in his pestering. He would purposefully speak softly so I wouldn't be able to hear him or follow me, and take my hearing aid. These were malevolent actions that were unexpected from a manager of his caliber. Every time, I had a wave of rage and attempted to fight David. But in order to accomplish my true objective, I had to control my fury and bear it. I had had enough of these days and needed to break. Then something went wrong. It took place amid a last-minute sales conference. Directors and department heads from several sales departments were present. As David's sales department's document preparer, I was expected to attend this meeting. I had never been to a sales meeting before. Given the simplicity of the documentation I provided, I didn't think my presence was required. There had to be a specific reason why David insisted on my presence at the meeting, as he was the only sales manager to bring an office secretary along. Prior to the meeting, I observed David's conduct closely. David took a step as soon as the meeting started. You fool Dropout from high school. Even in the absence of common sense. David, who sat beside me, yelled, What are you listening to during the meeting? As another department was presenting their sales report, remove it right away. David was apparently teasing my hearing aid. He should be aware that what I have on my ear is a hearing aid, not an earphone, as I had previously told him that I have hearing loss. David yells as if my hearing aid were an earpiece, even though he knows. My hearing impairment is unknown to the directors and other participants. I'm guessing David wants to make me look foolish and dumb to them. What use does it serve to accomplish that? Is he reacting to my investigation into the dangerous selling issue, or does he really detest me that much? I disregarded David's voice, not wanting to respond any longer. David, furious with my demeanor, abruptly got up and knocked over my chair. The conference room buzzed and I fell to the ground. The meeting room door opened at that very time. I apologize for being late. CEO Jones burst into the meeting room in the middle of the chaos. Jones's eyes widened as he attempted to process what was happening as he became aware of the tight mood in the room. His normally pink cheeks grew pale, and a scowl spread across his face when he spotted me lying there on the floor. Knowing that Jones was observing, David continued, Ignoring me, who do you think you are? You dare not treat me rudely. Jones's complexion grew more pale. I smiled slyly at Jones and whispered to myself, All right, this is enough. Gazing at Jones, David sought acknowledgement for his deeds. By reprimanding someone for using headphones during the meeting, he presumably believed he was impressing the directors and department heads in attendance. But in contrast to what David had anticipated, Jones's expression was one of extreme contempt. What do you think you're doing, David? Angrily, Jones yelled at David. David hesitated for a while at the sudden turn of events, but he soon collected himself and spoke informally. I chastised my subordinate for wearing earphones during the meeting. He then adopted a belligerent demeanor. I slowly stood up and leaned back in my chair while I listened to their chat. I gave David a demeaning smile. When David realized this, his rage erupted, and he drew a deep breath to yell at me. But Jones intervened. Do you mean that you were unaware of him? Was there a hearing impairment? There were no words left for David. You knew it was a hearing aid, yet you behaved so cruelly. What he has in his ear is not an earphone. Although Jones spoke quietly, it was clear that he was angry below. It took me off guard. David became agitated. David was surprised to learn that Jones was aware of my hearing loss. He believed he was the only person in the room who was aware of my identity. David sought to portray me as a foolish troublemaker based on his assumption, but all the guilt was placed on David when it became clear that he had acted in that way while aware of my condition. The attendees of the meeting started glaring at David. Amidst all of this, Jones sent a nervous glance my way. Jones was presumably thinking that something that shouldn't have happened had happened, and it was terrible news. Let's call off today's sales meeting, President. There are more urgent problems to take care of. I gave Jones a direct look and spoke up before the meeting. Frustrated, David darted in front of me. How dare you, a subordinate worker, make such remarks? You are a high school dropout with no business speaking to the president. Stop talking so much, David growled. But Jones cut me off right away. You should be the one keeping quiet, David. Jones gave David a contemptuous stare. Then he glanced over at me and apologized profusely. You're right. Let's call off our meeting for today. Who is that guy? Even though nobody spoke out loud, I could feel this question resounding in everyone's thoughts. The attendees glanced at Jones's manner of speaking with me, bewildered. They thought it odd that President Jones was talking to me, an employee, in such a formal manner. David had the same thoughts. Why are you president? Please keep quiet. Without even giving David a chance to respond, Jones yelled. The conference room was dead silent. Everyone's mind was racing with questions about David's misbehavior, the president's strange actions, and my identity, making it impossible for them to keep up. There was an eerie vibe in the air. The meeting has adjourned for today. We'll notify you of the new day and time. I want to thank each and every one of you, Jones said as she urged the guests to depart. David was undecided about staying in the room or going. He moved forward, feeling uneasy in this tight environment, but Jones stopped him with a wave of his hand. Come to the president's office, David, and you as well, James. David's shocked eyes grew wider. Probably what made him suspicious was that I was being called James by the president. He gave me a scowl, but now doubt replaced the hate in his eyes. David and I were at the president's office in no time at all. We were instructed to take a seat side by side on the sofas. There was nothing more to say to David now that we had not exchanged a word on our way out of the conference room. David, on the other hand, had a tight expression on his face, maybe from being afraid of me. My presence had become something unknown and menacing instead than a source of ridicule. Jones sat into the other couch, but no words emerged right away. Jones didn't seem to know how to strike up a conversation. David cast a questioning glance at the president, wondering what would happen next. At last, Jones noticed and said, David, I believe it would be best to reveal his true identity to you first. Jones looked at me and spoke. What's the deal here? Why is this guy getting such formal speech from the president? Without trying to hide his annoyance, David said. Jones interrupted him. He was dispatched by the parent company as an investigator. This phrase caused David's face to freeze. Then, trying to read my reaction, he turned a scared gaze on me. I grinned and gave him a small nod. My true role is with S Holdings Investigation Office. My role is to keep an eye on compliance among the group companies. I was sent to S Corporation for a reason, and that reason was a leak from within S Corporation. I got involved because there were a lot of reports of misbehavior in the sales department, notably in David's section, which was the focus of the investigation. I used a fake identity when I started working for the company. Only President Jones and a small group of HR staff members were aware of my true identity. What a spy he is, this coward! David was filled with wrath and wanted to call me a spy, to denigrate me. However, David was the one who was on the brink in this scenario, not me. It is he who ought to be pleading for pardon. But it didn't seem like he could reach that decision fast enough. David, please be mindful of your language, Jones chastised. I raised my voice, taking advantage of the lull in the discussion. Manager David, I am sorry for using false pretenses to infiltrate your team. I apologize, but this let us find a lot of problems with your work habits and the way you handle your employees. It was difficult for me to jump into a conversation with words flying around because of my hearing problem. I was lucky that Jones had silenced David. Since nobody of them said anything, I went on. Manager David, it seems you've been quite rough with your subordinates, yelling at them in front of others, and even resorting to physical punishment. David cut me off as I was speaking slowly and stopping between sentences. Hold on. I don't scream at my staff members. It's just not sweet love. And a hit of physical abuse? That is something I would never do. Who made that statement? Bring them over here. David continued to project confidence. He was certain that he had complete control over his subordinates and that nobody would turn against him. But David deserved to be punished for his conduct even if his subordinates had said nothing against them. David's actions toward me were obviously non-compliant. He couldn't avoid his own accountability, regardless of whether I was a spy or an investigator. You will eventually be held accountable for the way you treat your subordinates. But for the time being, let's ignore that. But the way you've been treating me is unacceptable. David had made fun of me because of my educational background and hearing problem, which made me a laughingstock. In addition to his earlier harassment, he attempted to make me look foolish and like a mischievous person by playing music during a meeting. Unlike the 1970s, such actions would not be allowed in the modern age of tight compliance rules. Manager David, do you have anything to say in your defense? David, on the other hand, was mute. I moved my eyes from the dumbfounded David to the dejected Jones. These actions were carried out by a manager who bears a great deal of responsibility for his position. As an investigator, not only was I present when they occurred, but they were also directed against me. Even the president was unable to hide this. Please see to it that this matter is appropriately handled. I strongly stated, just because it's an internal concern doesn't mean it should be ignored. Jones wore an expression of regret. Comprehensive. Manager David will be made to consider his actions and will get the proper disciplinary punishment. It's too early for David to feel defeated, yet he listened with his head down, appearing utterly despondent. Although his mistreatment of his subordinates is undoubtedly a concern, he is also a part of a larger problem. The investigation's primary emphasis is that problem. James, so does this conclude the investigation? The relief on Jones's face was visible to me. Head office may be satisfied with David's demotion from his manager role and salary reduction, but this is just the start. President, what are you talking about? This is really a minor issue. The primary problem now begins. I gave Jones a deep smile, and his face stiffened. David, on the other hand, gave off the impression that the inquiry against him was already complete. David, you're being naive, I said to myself. President, there's no need for Manager David to reflect on his actions. Jones's face twisted with discomfort at what I said. He was having difficulty grasping the notion of no need for reflection. David, meantime, had a perplexed expression and wondered. Maybe he felt he had the upper hand. If that's the case, he's really wrong. Manager David has to be fired right away. He has broken confidence in several instances, which is the reason. This is a grave breach of compliance and a felony. It cannot be resolved by simple contemplation. David got red in the face at that very moment. David stammered as he attempted to respond, unable to formulate a meaningful statement. Jones was the first one to speak. Did David break the trust? How do you mean? Jones looked at my face intently, trying to read my mind as she questioned. Although he could have anticipated David to be strict with his subordinates, the betrayal of confidence probably caught him off guard. He has been soliciting favors from clients in exchange for kickbacks, I said. I went into depth about the anomalies in the revenue of the sales department under David. I said that I had verified the results by sending investigators to those clients. Naturally, extensive internal investigations were conducted before dispatching investigators. David misjudged me due to my hearing disability. He reasoned that talking quietly would guarantee I couldn't hear him, even if I had a hearing aid. He talked recklessly about things he shouldn't have talked about, having learned from experience that I couldn't hear quiet talks. It's true that I wouldn't have been able to hear him if he had been whispering behind my back. That was another matter entirely if he was in my direct line of sight. I can understand what the other person is saying when I partially read lips. My understanding gets quite accurate if I can focus on just a little portion of the conversation's context. Manager David, you uttered some thoughtless remarks in front of me. I have all of the documentation as proof. You tricked me by pretending to be deaf. David was enraged. He was still confused about his role. This was not the moment to dispute my hearing capacity. Even though my hearing aren't working, I can still hear you with my eyes. I gave David a sly smile and told him about my libretting abilities. As he listened, David's shocked eyes grew wider. I kept going. Seeing David's face turn pale as I spoke, I described exactly where he had spoken and what he had said. I could see every conversation taking place in the meeting room without having to pull back the blinds. I was also aware of the taunts you had aimed at me and the absurd commands you gave to your staff. David leaned back in the couch. When Jones realized this, he spoke up. David, you truly are a madman. Because of your strong sales success, I was able to ignore some of your problems. But you idiot, it was all a charade. Jones growled and snapped at his lip. But David did not respond. He was stunned. In actuality, I was prompted to visit S Corporation due to a leak regarding this matter. An employee of the sales department, coerced by David to enable illicit resale, most likely couldn't handle the shame and reported it under false pretenses. David came dangerously close to finding me during the investigation, but my hearing loss helped conceal who I really was. President Jones, I will forward this information to the headquarters. Jones should be ready for the repercussions, I told him coolly. Taking David by the collar, he lifted him up and confronted him, saying, "This is all your fault. Leave my office now." Jones's voice seemed loud enough to reverberate throughout the office, yet David didn't appear to hear it at all. With his constrained viewpoint, David concluded that the president's remarks were no longer valuable to hear. Furious by David's demeanor, Jones vigorously kicked the rear of the couch David was seated on. David fell to the floor. I couldn't help but smile at him. Although David is a mess, Jones isn't all that much better. I laughed icily and hurried out of the president's office, disgusted. David received the consequence of being fired. After a thorough examination, it was discovered that the sales department as a whole was involved in significantly more unlawful resales and kickbacks than was initially thought. Put differently, practically every employee in the sales division was aware of it. Since the subordinates' main gain was a decrease in sales quotas, they were not further investigated, nevertheless. I saw David's attitude, so it makes sense that they were unable to resist. It is possible that the firm will sue David. Although the exact amount of damages is still being determined, it will surely be too much for him to pay back with his usual salary. David now lives alone in an old wooden flat after being dismissed and abandoned by his wife and daughter, whom he had met through an introduction from his superiors. He had very little money because his wife owned the majority of his possessions, including his house and automobile. It's uncertain how David will live from this point on, but it will surely be a very challenging journey. President Jones was moved to a different group company. He eventually became the director of the General Affairs Division of a nearby construction company. Despite being titled manager, he is only overseen by one part-time worker. Put succinctly, he was demoted. This was the result of his participation in the most recent controversy. His pay was drastically cut, and the workplace was far more unforgiving. Still, Jones took it. Maybe he had no other option. Regarding myself, I concluded the inquiry at ES Corporation and went back to the main office. The sales department, which David had overseen, expressed gratitude to me despite the unpleasant position I had to play. Reports stated that they could now carry out appropriate sales efforts because the tyrant was no longer in power. This time, I discovered the misbehavior by using my hearing impairment, something I typically view as a negative. I'm going to keep my attention on what I can control instead of whining about what I can't. It doesn't imply I should give up or that I shouldn't try to live, because I can't hear.